Hey guys, tonight we're settling into something a little different, but still sleepy, still slow, and still full of the quiet weirdness that history always gives us. So dim the lights, adjust the blanket, let your brain go into that soft, almost melty space. We're going to drift back in time, way back, far before kings were marrying their cousins like it was a competitive sport, before medieval princes were collecting illnesses the way modern people collect streaming subscriptions, and even before the first royal meltdown was carefully recorded by some very tired scribe. Tonight, we're rewinding the tape of humanity to about 70,000 years ago, which is roughly the point in the story where humans supposedly stopped evolving, or at least slowed down to the kind of lazy shuffle you'd expect from a species that had finally figured out how to cook food and gossip at the same time. Now, of course, humans didn't actually stop evolving. Biology doesn't throw its hands up and declare a permanent vacation, but something did shift, something subtle, something quiet enough to slip into the background, the way your air conditioner hums at night until you don't hear it anymore. And that's where we'll be floating for the next little while, in that quiet space where our ancestors were still figuring out how to not die from berries, weather, or each other. So get comfortable. Let's drift back to a world with fewer people, more mammoths, and absolutely zero inbred kings, which honestly might be the most relaxing part of this entire journey. Let's settle into the first layer of the story. For most of human existence, evolution moved slowly, in the gentle, almost pathetic way you'd expect from a species just trying to not be eaten by things with better teeth. Early Homo sapiens weren't doing much besides wandering around, complaining about cold nights, and trying to make rocks behave like tools. Their lives were simple. Every day was a group project, and nobody was the responsible student. But around 70,000 years ago, something odd happened. Not dramatic, not explosive, more like the world pressed the slow motion button on our species. Our bodies stopped changing as quickly. Our brains settled into a certain size, and the big flashy traits that define modern humans had already shown up. Language, symbolic thought, questionable decision-making, all the classics. If evolution had been a reality show, this would have been the part where the producers stopped adding new characters. But to understand why we entered this long, quiet plateau, we need to look at what life was actually like for the small handful of humans wandering around at the time. And I do mean small. The entire human population then was probably something like a few thousand, a number so tiny that a whole species could have fit into a modern stadium and still had room for snack vendors. Imagine that. Every human on Earth, all of them, standing together on the grass at a football match, probably arguing over whose turn it was to go find firewood, probably blaming each other for things like the bad berries and who left the cave door open, even though caves don't have doors. Now, these early humans had already gone through a major evolutionary globe before this point. Bigger brains, upright posture, smaller jaws, all the physical upgrades required to eventually invent things like agriculture, alphabet soup, and TikTok. And because these upgrades already existed, there wasn't a lot left for natural selection to do besides stand around and offer occasional commentary like a tired coach watching a team that refuses to improve. So what were these people actually like? Picture a group of tall, slightly wiry humans who were surprisingly good at endurance running. The kind of people who would jog after an antelope until the antelope just gave up from embarrassment. Their brains were big enough to tell stories by firelight, argue about nothing, and remember which plants made you see colors that definitely weren't there. If you met one of them today, cleaned up their hair, handed them a hoodie, and showed them how to use a bus pass, they'd blend in, maybe a little quieter, maybe a little baffled by touchscreens, but biologically, they'd pass for one of us. And that is exactly the point. By 70,000 years ago, the human blueprint was basically locked in. Slight upgrades would happen later: lighter skin in northern areas, lactose tolerance for people who had the great idea to drink cow juice, and immune system tweaks to avoid dying from every sneeze on the planet. But the major architectural work was finished. You don't renovate a house after the walls are already painted, and evolution didn't feel like repainting the human skeleton. But of course, this wasn't because humans became perfect. Far from it. They were still fragile little creatures whose best survival strategy was travel in groups and scream loudly when predators appear. The real reason evolution slowed was simple. Once a species spreads out, stabilizes, and stops dying in gigantic numbers every 5 minutes, natural selection becomes more like an optional suggestion. Early humans had finally reached a point where they weren't constantly being forced to evolve or die. They had tools, they had fire, they had cooperation, they had just enough brainpower to get through the day without wandering directly into a hole. And that's when the evolutionary treadmill slowed down. There's also the small matter of the Toba supereruption, an absolutely massive volcanic explosion that some researchers think nearly wiped out humans around the same time. Whether it was as dramatic as it sounds is still debated, but it might have compressed humanity into a very small gene pool. Smaller gene pool means less variation. Less variation means evolution has fewer options to work with. It's like trying to redecorate a house using only items from the clearance aisle. But the result was a population of humans who were remarkably similar to each other. Not identical, not clones, just close enough that the species settled into a kind of biological pause. We were done being sculpted by nature's chisel. Now we would be shaped by culture, stories, ideas, and eventually, kings who made decisions so bad that historians still need therapy. But we'll get to the kings later. For now, let's float slowly across the ancient world. Imagine early humans walking along coastlines, picking up shells with the same curiosity toddlers have when they find anything shiny. They left handprints on cave walls. They wrapped themselves in furs. They stared at the stars without knowing what stars were. They were modern enough to wonder about the world, but not modern enough to complain about the Wi-Fi. And in this long, quiet stretch of time, the human species settled into itself, a bit like a teenager finally stabilizing after an awkward growth spurt. No more sudden brain expansions, no more dramatic changes to the skull, no more jaw shrinking, just a slow, steady glide toward the era when humans would stop worrying about being eaten and start worrying about how many goats counted as a dowry. Let's drift a little deeper now, into the habits, the quirks, the personalities, because while evolution may have slowed, human weirdness most definitely did not. Early humans had their own dramas, small group tensions, the prehistoric equivalent of who keeps leaving dishes in the sink. They had informal leaders, probably someone with the energy of an exhausted camp counselor, someone who didn't ask to be in charge but somehow ended up settling every argument, deciding where to sleep, and trying to convince the group that no, the thunder spirit probably wasn't angry at them specifically. In short, humanity was already human, and evolution's job, at least the flashy part of it, was mostly done. Let's ease forward a little. Not rushing, just gliding. In the next part, we'll follow early humans as they drift across continents, carry their strange little habits with them, and accidentally set the stage for every dysfunctional royal family that would eventually appear on the planet. Let's ease back into the story. Slow breaths, soft blanket. We're still floating in that early human haze where everyone is barefoot, slightly hungry, and deeply confused about most things. Evolution has taken its foot off the gas. Our ancestors are wandering, and they're carrying with them all the habits, frustrations, and little personality quirks that would eventually bloom into the full human chaos we know and love today. So picture this, it's still about 70,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. Time wasn't exactly punctual back then. Humans were clustering in tiny groups, moving when the food moved, stopping when their legs gave out, and arguing over whose turn it was to stay awake by the fire, so a wildebeest wouldn't stroll into the camp in the middle of the night. The usual. And while these early humans weren't evolving much on a biological level, they were evolving socially, slowly, calmly, sort of the way a group of tired roommates figures out a cleaning schedule only after everyone is too exhausted to fight about it anymore. They were learning to cooperate in ways that would feel oddly familiar today, sharing food, telling stories, singing quietly around fires, trying to remember which mushrooms wouldn't cause hallucinations strong enough to make them walk straight into a lake. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just soft, steady human life. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about humans leaving Africa, we usually imagine one big heroic migration, a single, determined march with dramatic music swelling in the background. But that's not what happened. Early humans didn't set out. They didn't hold a meeting. They didn't say, "All right, team, let's discover Eurasia." They drifted, slowly, lazily, the way people wander around a grocery store when they aren't sure what they're hungry for. If somewhere had food, they stayed. If the food ran out, they moved. If the weather was tolerable, great. If it wasn't, they packed up and tried somewhere slightly less terrible. A few families went this way, a few went that way. Most probably didn't know where they were going. They just walked until something interesting appeared on the horizon. Picture a group of humans at a shoreline. One of them sees land in the distance and says something like, "Maybe we go that way." And everyone else shrugs, because honestly, what else were they going to do? They had no calendars, no deadlines, no in-laws to visit. Time was wide open. This slow movement created little pockets of humans everywhere, tiny coastal groups, small inland families, wandering bands leaving footprints that would vanish the moment the next storm rolled in. And all the while, evolution was basically asleep at the wheel. But culturally, things were stacking up. Fire use was getting more sophisticated. Someone figured out how to use stones to scrape animal hides, which suddenly made winter slightly less awful. Someone else figured out that charcoal makes great drawing material, which eventually gave us the first prehistoric art. And of course, someone had to invent gossip, because we all know humans did not wait tens of thousands of years to start complaining about each other. That skill comes baked in. Let's float over to something else happening at the time. Population growth. It was slow, painfully slow, like watching grass grow in a cold climate. But every now and then the numbers went up just enough for small groups to split. A few cousins would wander off to form a new camp. Maybe they were fed up with the old leader. Maybe the hunting grounds were crowded. Maybe they just needed a break from Uncle Rockolector, who kept bringing home stones and insisting they had good energies. Whatever the reason, this splitting created distance, and distance created variation in behavior. Not biological variation, but cultural quirks. Some groups developed favorite foods. Others preferred certain tools. Some had a tradition of singing softly before bed. Others might have painted their bodies before hunting. These were tiny, almost invisible differences. The sort of thing you'd never notice unless you lived within the group, but they mattered. They were the early seeds of cultures, long before anyone would carve a symbol or build a ritual site. Now, even though humans weren't changing much biologically, they were exploring environments that demanded little tweaks. Nothing fancy, just the kind of slow adjustments nature makes when it isn't bored, but also isn't busy. People in colder regions developed slightly stockier bodies. People in hotter regions stayed lanky. People who lived near rivers became excellent swimmers. People in mountains developed strong legs. But these were tweaks, not overhauls. Evolution wasn't gone. It just wasn't rushing. Imagine a tailor who has already finished your outfit but keeps doing little touches at the edges because they can help themselves. That was nature at this point, quietly pressing seams. Let's slide forward again. Humans were moving across the Arabian Peninsula, skirting the edges of the Indian Ocean. Some groups settled on beaches and lived off shellfish. Others went inland. A few entered regions so unforgiving that even evolutionary patience wasn't enough, and those small branches of humanity faded away. But the ones who kept going carried something important with them. Memory. Not written memory. Not tribal laws. Not religious texts. Just simple memories passed by voice. Which plants to avoid. Which animals were unpredictable. Where good water could be found. How to make a fire when everything was wet. These tiny bits of knowledge were quietly shaping the human mind. Teaching it to imagine possibilities. Teaching it to recall danger. Teaching it to plan ahead in ways other species couldn't. And that mental flexibility, more than any physical trait, is why evolution didn't need to keep remodeling the human form. The mind was doing the heavy lifting. Let's glide toward one of the most interesting shifts, tool-making. Humans had been making stone tools forever, but around this time they got better at it. Not because their brains got bigger, but because their communities grew stable enough to pass down skills. A child could watch an adult shape a blade and learn the steps. A teenager could practice. An elder could refine the technique, slowly, calmly, quietly. This created consistency. Tools in theropod regions started looking similar because the methods were being conserved. That was the beginning of human tradition, not in a ceremonial sense, just technically, a method taught by repetition. It also meant something subtle. When survival depends more on shared knowledge than on physical traits, evolution stops selecting for brute biological advantages. The environment stops pressuring the body and starts pressuring the culture. In short, humans didn't need new muscles. They needed better conversations. And that's exactly what they built. Tiny networks of communication across the ancient world. Spoken words, hand signals, shared tasks, cooperative hunts, quiet exchanges around firelight. Let's drift a little further north now. Some humans began entering cooler climates. Snow, ice, long nights. These challenges weren't solved through genetic miracles. They were solved through clothing, shelter, shared labor, and fire. Evolution sat back and said, well, if you guys want to handle the hard stuff yourselves, be my guest. And humans did. By this point, our species was scattered across Africa, Arabia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Small pockets, small families, everyone doing their own thing. But the biological machine behind them was mostly the same. The differences were social, practical, and sometimes just based on group personality. Imagine one group that loved river fishing, another that trusted nothing with fins and scales, one that painted bodies, another that decorated tools, one that followed lunar cycles, another that wandered without patterns at all. These tiny differences were the seeds that would eventually grow into cultures, languages, traditions, and later, kingdoms that tore themselves apart in the most dramatic and poorly thought out ways imaginable. We'll get there slowly, very slowly. But for now, humans were steady, drifting from coastlines to forests, from forests to plains, from plains to mountains. No rush, no destination, just a calm migration that lasted thousands of years. Let's float into the next part soon, where we'll watch early humans enter Europe and Asia, meet the neighbors Neanderthals and Denisovans and handle it with the usual human mix of confusion, cooperation, and questionable decision-making. Let's drift back into the ancient landscape, softly, no rush. We're gliding west and north now, into the colder parts of Eurasia, where the air was sharp, the nights were long, and the neighbors were, well, bigger than us. Yes, it's finally time for the world's strangest family reunion. So imagine our early Homo sapiens wandering into Europe and Western Asia. Same bodies we have today, same brains, same habit of making questionable choices with full confidence. They were following herds, tracking rivers, and quietly arguing about whether the weather was cold or just annoying cold. And then one day, somewhere in a forest clearing or a rocky valley, they came face to face with a group of Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals get a bad reputation. People imagine them as big, angry cavemen smashing things with clubs, but they were actually skilled hunters, toolmakers, and surprisingly tender caregivers. They looked a bit stockier than us, with wider chests and shorter limbs that helped them survive colder climates. Think of them as the original lumberjack cousins, the ones who could split a log with one hand and make a stone blade with the other. So here's the scene. Two groups of humans, different species, but close enough biologically that things got complicated, socially awkward, a little messy, like every extended family gathering ever. And, of course, modern humans did what modern humans always do when confronted with cousins they barely recognize. They panicked a little, then they mingled, and eventually they shared more than just hunting tips, because of course they did. Evolution didn't stop, but human behavior was already operating on its own schedule. Before long, there was gene flow happening across Eurasia, not aggressively, not dramatically, more like two groups watching each other across a campfire and going, well, they seem nice. This mixing gave us traits that still exist today: immunity boosts, metabolism tweaks, cold weather advantages, a few quirky genetic leftovers that scientists are still trying to explain. It wasn't evolution reinventing humans, it was evolution doing small edits, quiet, subtle proofreading. Meanwhile, humans were learning from these cousins. Neanderthals knew the land. They understood how to survive harsh winters. They made beautifully crafted tools, often more symmetrical than our ancestors' versions. And our ancestors borrowed ideas in the calm, unceremonious way humans always do when they see someone else doing something better. Imagine a small group of sapiens watching Neanderthals carve a stone tool. One sapiens whispers, "Why doesn't ours look like that?" Another shrugs, "Because you keep rushing it." Knowledge spread, slowly, quietly, the kind of exchange you'd miss if you weren't looking closely. Let's drift a little further east, into the lands where Denisovans lived. They're the mysterious cousins, the ones nobody knew existed, until a scientist found a finger bone in a Siberian cave, and said, well, that's new. They left almost no fossils, just tiny clues that they were out there, surviving in harsh landscapes with quiet determination. And once again, our ancestors met them. And once again, humans did what humans do. A little trading, a little sharing, a little genetic collaboration. Denisovan genes live today in people across Asia and Oceania, especially in groups who live at high altitude. That's right. Thousands of years before anyone invented mountain climbing, Denisovans gifted humanity a high-altitude adaptation, a quiet, biological party favor. But here's the important part. Even though these encounters spread genes around, they didn't dramatically change the sapiens' blueprint. We didn't suddenly grow Denisovan muscles or Neanderthal skulls. Evolution wasn't layering on new upgrades. It was more like exchanging seasoning when cooking. A spice here, a flavor there. Nothing overwhelming, because the big changes, the major hardware was already set. This is the era where humans started relying more on flexibility than biology. When a new environment appeared, people didn't evolve new traits. They simply adapted their behavior, build better shelters, hunt different animals, wrap themselves in thicker fur, share fire, share techniques, share stories about the time Uncle Flintknocker wandered into a snowbank and had to be rescued. All of it slow, all of it calm. Let's ease further into the everyday life of these early humans in Eurasia. They formed small camps along rivers. They hunted large animals in groups. They knew the movement cycles of herds. They understood seasons. Maybe not in a scientific way, but in the rhythm of daily survival. Nights were long and cold. Fires crackled quietly. People huddled close. Stories were shared in voices barely above whispers. The first myths started forming, not written down, not formal. Just ideas floating through the firelight about animals, spirits, ancestors, or the strange stars overhead. And still, evolution was mostly asleep. Humans had already crossed the biological threshold where brains were capable of imagination. Once that happened, nature let the brain handle the rest. Culture became the engine. Knowledge became the new adaptation. Let's drift past the big landscapes now. Forests, plains, icy valleys. Humans explored them all. Tools slowly improved. Social bonds grew stronger. Groups expanded to 30, 40, maybe even 50 members at times. Too many to keep quiet around a campfire, but just enough to share tasks and survive. And somewhere in this long, slow era, humans developed something important: patience. Tracking animals required it. Learning new environments demanded it. Surviving winters depended on it. And calm, steady patience made dramatic evolutionary leaps unnecessary. Imagine nature watching early humans struggle through a blizzard, build a shelter, wrap themselves in hides, and warm themselves by the fire. At some point, evolution probably shrugged and said, "They've got it handled. Let's float forward again." Over thousands of years, sapiens spread deeper into Europe, farther into Asia, and eventually toward the Pacific. Every step they took added cultural layers. Knowledge spread. Tools standardized. Campfire stories grew richer. People remembered where their grandparents had traveled, and passed down tiny fragments of history that lasted far longer than anyone expected. And through all this, humans stayed biologically similar, because they didn't need to change. They had already reached the point where the brain, not the skeleton, was in charge. Let's settle back in. Slow breathing, soft shoulders. We're drifting into one of the calmest stretches in human history, a time when life became strangely predictable. Not easy, not comfortable, just stable enough that the species didn't need new biological tricks to keep going. It's around 50 to 60,000 years ago now. Our ancestors are spread across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe. They're living in little camps and seasonal shelters. Nothing permanent yet. Nothing you could point at and call a house. Just clusters of humans huddling around smoky fires, grumbling about the weather and trying not to lose their only sharp blade. This is the era when humanity starts behaving less like wandering animals and more like small communities. The kind of communities where people know each other too well. You can imagine it. Someone snores. Someone talks too much. Someone always forgets to bring the water skin. Someone tells long hunting stories that absolutely did not happen the way they say they did. And through all of this, evolution is basically lounging on a couch, watching us figure life out. Because once a species has tools, cooperation, language, and a decent brain size, mutations don't make much difference anymore. A kid could be born a little taller, a little shorter, a little smarter, a little slower. But culture picks up the slack. Group living takes the pressure off individual survival. The weaknesses get supported. The strengths get shared. This is when humans begin to act like humans. Let's float into early rituals. Nothing dramatic, nothing like temples or priests. Just simple gestures that show people were starting to think symbolically. Someone placed flowers around a burial. Someone painted on a cave wall. Someone arranged stones in a circle, for reasons nobody wrote down. These weren't religious moments in any organized sense. They were emotional moments, a response to loss, a way to mark a place, a way to say, we were here. Tiny sparks of meaning in a world that didn't require evolution but demanded imagination. And humans were good at imagination. Too good. Sometimes, a twig breaking in the forest at night became a sign. A strange shadow became a spirit. A dream became a message. This wasn't fear. It was interpretation. The early mind, trying to make sense of a world full of danger and wonder, with no instruction manual at all. Let's glide to the domestic side of things. Early camps probably had roles, but nothing strict. The strongest hunted. The patient ones gathered. The sharp-eyed tracked animals. Elders taught knowledge. Kids wandered around underfoot, doing whatever kids in any era do, asking loud questions, tripping over rocks, and losing things. You can imagine an older woman showing a younger person how to scrape a hide, not with any ceremony, just passing the skill along because someone had to. You can imagine a group of teenagers trying to shape their own tools and ruining the stone entirely, and the elders sighing, because yes, this was the third time that week. Humans formed routines, morning tasks, midday hunts, evening fires, night watches. Evolution didn't need to reinvent bones when behavior was doing the heavy work of survival. Let's float over to a topic that helped humans even more: sharing. Early humans shared food at a level that still surprises researchers. Other animals share occasionally. Humans shared constantly. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. If one person failed to catch anything, the group fed them. If one person had a lucky hunt, everyone ate. This kind of cooperation meant fewer people died. Fewer deaths meant fewer evolutionary pressures. Evolution loves pressure. It thrives on crisis. But when crisis softens even a little, it slows, and this era was calm enough for that to happen. Now, let's drift through the environment. These early communities lived in landscapes full of megafauna, big animals, not quite storybook giant, but large enough that humans respectfully kept their distance unless the entire group was involved. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all slow-moving background characters in humanity's long journey. And against this backdrop, humans did the most human thing possible. They talked. Language wasn't polished yet. Probably no grammar lessons, no complex sentences, no grand speeches, but enough structure existed for people to tell stories, to warn about dangers, to describe places, to complain about cold winds, to scold children who wandered too close to the fire, to argue about where to set the camp next season. This talk, quiet, practical, constant, became the foundation of everything to come. Communication replaced brute evolution. Language replaced instinct. Memory replaced mutation. Let us ease toward one of the most interesting behaviors that shows up in this era: territory. Not fences, not borders, just quiet recognition that our group lives here. Humans developed a sense of place. They remembered good hunting grounds. They recognized valleys. They revisited rivers. This wasn't ownership. It was familiarity, but it was enough to anchor groups to seasonal roots. This familiarity boosted survival, and once again, nature took a step back. The more humans learned, the less evolution needed to do. We can drift into one more detail before we close this part: social tensions. Even with stable life, small groups had problems. Too few people meant too little genetic diversity. Too close of a group meant someone always annoyed someone else. A loud chewer, a chronic complainer, a person who hoarded stones because they might be useful someday. Conflicts happened, quiet disagreements, muted frustrations. A leader stepping in gently to settle things, not because they were powerful, just because they were the most patient adult available. Human life moved slowly. No permanent settlements, no major technological leaps, no dramatic shifts, just thousands of years of calm, steady, almost sleepy routine. And through all of it, evolution idled in the background, touching up little genetic details when necessary, but mostly letting humans run on culture, memory, and habit. In Part 5, we'll glide into the next stretch of deep prehistory, how humans handled environmental upheavals, ice ages, and slow climate shifts without evolving new bodies, relying entirely on adaptability, cooperation, and that quiet, stubborn human tendency to keep going no matter what. By this point in the story, humans were no longer just reacting to the world around them, they were starting to shape it. The shift was slow and almost invisible, but it was real. You can imagine small groups noticing patterns in the land. They learned which trees survived harsh winters, which roots tasted good even when the season was dry, and which paths animals used year after year. Nothing about this was fast. It was generations of quiet observation, shared stories, and simple survival. This stability mattered. When a species reaches a point where culture can solve problems faster than biology, natural selection relaxes. If you can survive a cold night by building a shelter, you no longer need a body adapted to extreme cold. If you can store food, you don't need to evolve a stomach built for scarcity. Skill replaces mutation. Cooperation replaces raw instinct. Language played an even bigger role. It didn't appear suddenly. It deepened over thousands of years. People didn't just communicate danger or food. They started talking about ideas. They explained how to make a sharper tool. They remembered where a river changed course. They taught children what their ancestors had learned. With each new layer of communication, the need for physical adaptation faded a little more. By 70,000 years ago, humans were essentially modern, not in technology, but in mind. The basic shape of our intelligence was set. The brain didn't need to double in size again. It just needed to reuse the tools it already had. Every generation added a little more knowledge to the one before it. Evolution stepped aside because culture took the wheel. And while the world around them was still wild and unpredictable, humans had found a different kind of stability within themselves. They no longer waited for nature to solve their problems. They solved them together.